could join us this evening. Just to give you a lay of the land, Kori will lead us in an opening prayer. I'll give you just an introduction to Liz and then allow her to carry on from there. And we're going to, at the end of the meeting, have some time for question and answers. So I would invite you, if you have a question that you have for Liz, that you put it in the chat for now, and we'll keep that and try to get through as many questions as we can towards the end. So Kori, lead us in prayer, please.
And just one more announcement. We ask that you mute yourself when you're not speaking to preserve audio quality, and that this meeting is being recorded. Let us take a breath and center ourselves in the presence of the Holy One. God of justice and compassion, who is with Jesus as he blessed the poor, who is with Jesus as he flipped tables in the temple, help us to listen and to learn as we gather tonight. Strengthen us for the work of your justice in this world. And may we always persist in hope to transform this world with your love. We pray. Amen.
Amen. So it's my pleasure to introduce Liz this evening. From what I can gather is that Liz, for nearly her entire life, has been an advocate and organizer on behalf of poor people's economic rights. When Liz attended undergrad at University of Pennsylvania, and there she participated in the Empty Shelters, a student organization at UPenn. Further down the road, she co-founded the Kensington Welfare Rights for Poor People's Economic Rights campaign. And she attended Union Theological Seminary, where she received her MDiv as an ordained Presbyterian minister scholar. She also got her master's in philosophy there and her PhD at UPenn. In 2017, she co-founded the Poor People's Campaign along with Reverend William Barber, and it has grown substantially, beginning as a grassroots anti-poverty social justice commitment, and is the largest nonviolent organization in the 21st century. Most of us, Liz, are Roman Catholic women priests, and we were really excited that you were willing to come and join us in conversation. Those of us who started in the Western region, the Good Troublemakers campaign, we really wanted to, we saw the work of the Poor People's Campaign, and we wanted to align ourselves in that work and that ministry as priests of a 21st century reality. So we're so grateful you're here with us this evening, and we look forward to what you have to share and offer with us. So thank you so much for your time this evening.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me. And, you know, I will share some remarks or some thoughts. And then I'm mostly hoping it's a conversation, just because I think that often is the most effective way for us to kind of dream up more good trouble. And I like being a part of a group of troublemakers, especially when we're crafting some good trouble. But as Maureen said, I've been dedicated to doing social justice organizing, especially from a faith perspective, since I was a very little person. I was going to protests and helping to organize anti-racist events and social justice and peace events from a very young age. I was raised in the Presbyterian church by a mom who ended up Presbyterian because her father went off to the Korean War, and although they should have been Armenian Orthodox, the closest church was a Presbyterian one. So she was raised Presbyterian and then raised me. My father is probably an atheist, but he grew up going to the Greek Orthodox Church. And I have a bunch of evangelicals in the mix, and I married into a Irish Italian Catholic family. So we have a lot of different things going on religiously in my life. So I want to talk a little bit about, the work that the Poor People's Campaign, a National Call for Moral Revival, is doing. Again, I think some of y'all are involved and familiar, but it's still, I think, often helpful to kind of start where we start. And then again, hopefully that we can just kind of continue in a more informal conversation. So as Maureen was saying, we basically formed the Poor People's Campaign in 2017, 50 years after Dr. King and the welfare rights movement, Cesar Chavez and United Farm Workers and many others actually were talking about the Achilles heel of the triple evils of systemic racism, poverty, and militarism. And the Poor People's Campaign was, Dr. King was killed before it officially launched. But still later that year in May and June, there were 9 caravans that happened from different parts of the country that converged in Washington, D.C. for a resurrection city that was set up. So we were approaching, I was actually introduced to the Poor People's Campaign by folks that were involved from the welfare rights movement and from other organizations of poor and homeless people, many, many years ago, decades ago, in fact, had made kind of connection with folks in Marks, Mississippi, which was where the mule train, one of the largest and most important caravans of the Poor People's Campaign left from, talked with folks at the 30th anniversary, the 35th anniversary, had people in Marks and Memphis and the 40th anniversary. But around the 45th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign, founded the Kairos Center, of which I direct at this point. We're kind of looking at the intersection of human rights and the religions of the world and what they have to bring to building a movement from below. And as we approach the 45th anniversary of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, we said, well, we can't go to another 50th year anniversary and not finish the work that was left unfinished. At that point, there had been a bunch of 50th anniversaries kind of coming up, and there were all of these kind of, proud celebrations. We were in Selma, for instance, around the voting rights victories. And, anyone that has been to Selma lately knows both about the, massive voter suppression that is taking place, as well as just the deep poverty and systemic racism that is still so present. And so, many of us said, again, if you're truly trying to honor the welfare rights women, if you're really trying to honor the indigenous people that came forward saying we need to organize, unite, and if you're trying to, take up the mantle of someone like Dr. King, then you have to kind of reach back into the blood and then pick up the baton and carry it the next mile. And so we launched the Cairo Center with the distinct purpose of reigniting a Poor People's Campaign for today. And at our launch event, symposium, I invited Reverend Barber out of North Carolina, who is some months into the Moral Mondays, Forward Together Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina at the time. This was the fall of 2013, and those protests had started in the spring. And kind of the rest is history. The idea was bringing the network of poor and homeless people that I had been organizing with, folks without health care, farm workers that were organizing low-wage workers, and then the kind of powerful witness and movement building, out of the South, out of North Carolina, that Reverend Barber and so many others were a part of. And at first, actually in 2016, we did a moral revival tour. And then out of there, we said, well, I would keep on talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and Reverend Barber would keep on talking about the need for a moral revival. And we said, well, let's do this, together. So when we launched or called for the campaign, what we said would be the founding kind of work, the founding activity was to organize 40 days of nonviolent civil disobedience and direct action, and do so in states across the country, led by poor and impacted folks, moral leaders and clergy and activists. And we didn't go to the big national organizations first. We went just to folk, poor people's organizations, grassroots efforts on the ground, and said, what do you think about this kind of radical idea of doing kind of both civil disobedience and then also kind of longer term kind of permanently organizing our communities from the bottom up. And we wanted there to be about 25 states that would participate in the first activities. And what we found, and we went to 15 places, and we had folks from about 35 gathered, and so many different grassroots leaders and so many states were interested that when we pulled off the first 40 days of action starting on Mother's Day of 2018 and going to the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, we had about 40 states involved. And what folks did was organized at the grassroots level, but at state capitals. Because in part, so many of the most regressive policies are being passed actually on a state level. And so much of the kind of wins that you can have in this state because of, states' rights and all this kind of other stuff that we might have some critique of, but is actually also on a state level. And so we said we want to be a national movement, but a national movement isn't one that has a PO box in Washington, D.C., or even pulls off the biggest actions in D.C., but it's nationalizing state-based movements. And so what formed out of those days of action and out of the work to have them were coordinating committees made up of a diverse grouping of folks, but with poor people, impacted folks, in the lead in those states. And now we have between 43 and 45 states where there are coordinating committees that are active. And to be a coordinating committee of the Poor People's Campaign, it means having, a diversity of folks involved. It's not just like a Chicago Poor People's Campaign or a Philadelphia Poor People's Campaign. It's a state campaign. And so if folks are, in 2 or 3 of the cities and don't have a reach as much into the rest of the state, then folks do a bunch of work to make sure that we're going to have a racial diversity, a geographic diversity, a religious diversity, not for the sake of diversity, but for a sake of representation of who is living in our states and who is being impacted by poverty, by racism, by ecological devastation, and by militarism. So we've kind of identified 5 issues as the kind of core interlocking injustices that we're trying to address. We start with the issue of systemic racism and look at it through policy, through structure. So it's everything from voter suppression to mass incarceration, to unjust immigration policies, to the mistreatment of Native American and Indigenous communities. it's about the fact that 60% of Black folk in this country are poor or low income. 65% of Latinas are poor or low income. 63% of Native and Indigenous people. And just the numbers are really great. The disproportionate impact of poverty and low incomes on communities of color are really striking. And yet, in raw numbers, there's a lot more poor white people than any other racial ethnic group. And so, the idea here is, how do we unite people across all of those divisions, including here in the United States, across race and geography? Then connected to racism is poverty. And we actually engaged in a big kind of audit of what has happened in this country and where things are over the past 50 years since Dr. King and the welfare rights leaders and others, launched and called for a Poor People's Campaign. And we found out that rather than the 40 million that are living below the poverty line, that the poverty line, the federal poverty line of this country is wholly inaccurate. It's based on a 1960s measure of 3 times a family's food budget. It was probably inaccurate then, but now food is surely not one of the most expensive pieces of people's family budgets. It means that if you're a single adult and you're making more than $12,000 a year, you're not considered poor. And if you're a family of 4 and you're making more than $24,500 a year, you're not poor. And so we used the Census Bureau statistic of the supplemental poverty measure, which is, that factors kind of more things like housing, transportation, healthcare, the real significant costs of life and living, and found that there's 140 million people who are in poverty, or one fire, one storm, one healthcare crisis, one job loss, one less than $400 emergency from being out on the streets, being unable to pay your bills, being poor, and from there we really tried to sound the alarm and shift the narrative about who is poor and why people are poor, and the real kind of numbers and people behind the 140 million people. That is 43.5% of the US population. Any nation that has almost half of its people living in poverty, especially a nation that espouses to be the richest country in the world in human history, is not a secure, safe, sound, just society. We then connected to the issue of ecological devastation. Now, Dr. King had talked about these 3 evils. I'm sure folk are familiar with this kind of tripartite evils that he talked about. And for sure, climate change and the destruction of our earth was an issue then. And in fact, there were folks at Resurrection City that were raising and sounding the alarm. But today, if you look at these issues of racism, of poverty, of militarism, you can't separate out the ecological crisis. The communities that are hurt first and hurt worst by climate change, by weather events, by storms, by pollution, really are poor and marginalized communities. And it was really in conversation with impacted communities that we kept on hearing over and over and over again that we have to take on this, earth crisis, this ecology crisis, this climate crisis. One of the things we found in that audit is that, although we hear a lot about Flint, Michigan, there's actually 4 million families that have poisoned water in this country. And there's 15 million people who can't afford water. It might be that they don't have their water shut off yet, but basically, if you use the standards of water affordability, despite the fact, as Dr. King said, the world is made up of 2/3 water, there's 15 million people in this country who can't actually afford water. and that's part of also an ecological crisis where you get corporations like water corporations like Nestle that bottle the same water that the folks in Detroit are having to pay, exorbitant water bills and are living without running water. But Nestle can bottle that same water for $150 a year of a permit and then sell it and make billions. And then if you're poor and you can't afford your water bill, you don't just live without water, you risk losing your house and losing your children. And so we then kind of connect ecological devastation to militarism and the war economy. The fact that the US spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on the military and less than 15 cents on anti-poverty programs, healthcare, education, and living wages combined. Budgets are deeply moral documents where a nation spends its money, where a family spends its money, where a community spends its money is where its priorities are. And clearly, we can make the world a lot safer if we were to cut our military budget in half, and we would still have a larger military budget than Russia, Iran, China, and a bunch of countries combined. And then we'd save lives, and we'd have more resources to invest in education, to invest in healthcare, and invest in all the things that we need. And then we kind of connect those four injustices and say what kind of holds it all together, what wraps it all together is a false moral narrative, kind of distorted narrative of religious, but especially Christian, white evangelical Christian nationalism. And that, that narrative, blames poor people, blames women, blames queer people, blames immigrants, blames people of color for all of society's problems, tries to pit us all against each other, and feeds us a lie that there's not enough, that this is as good as it gets, that, poverty might be, unfortunate, but it's inevitable when we're living in a world of unbelievable abundance, right? The US throws away more food than it takes, not just to feed everyone in this country, but around the whole world, right? So there's 5 abandoned houses for every homeless person. In this country, I mean, just like we have this unbelievable abundance. And it isn't even at the expense of the rest of the world or at the expense of the environment. We have this abundance and yet we have a scarcity of political will to change the levers of power and distribution of wealth and power. And so the Poor People's Campaign is focused on 2 things. One is shifting the narrative, getting us to kind of understand these issues, come up with solutions to these problems, have a public action discussion on these issues, and then build the power of that 140 million poor and low income people to be able to, in the words of Dr. King, make the power structures of this nation say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. We launched with this massive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience. We kind of then convened a year later and held a very significant Poor People's Moral Action Congress. And then this past June, we held the largest online social media kind of gathering of poor and low income people in this country, where about 2.5 to 3 million people joined us for a couple hour program where we kind of put out the stories and the solutions coming out of grassroots communities of people that are impacted, but coming forward and kind of rising in power around what we can do about this. And one of the things that we really talk about in the campaign is that we don't want to just kind of curse the darkness. We don't want to just talk about all the things that are wrong, but we want to kind of shed a light on the possibility, the hope, the potential for changing all of these issues. And so we have a budget that we kind of presented to the House Budget Committee, and we have a policy platform called the Jubilee Policy Platform, after kind of the biblical concept of jubilee, of debt relief, of releasing slaves, of paying people a living wage, of lending out money and knowing you'll never get paid back, and that this is what makes a prosperous society. This is what makes a just society for everybody. And so we have that platform, and in this past couple of months, we've been really spending a lot of time kind of unleashing the power of poor and low income voters. What we found when we studied 2016 election results was that if poor and low income people had turned out in the kinds of numbers that higher income people had, in 15 states, they would have exceeded the margin of victory. We would not have Donald Trump for the past 4 years. And so we went to work reaching out to 2.3 million poor and low income people in 10 different key states. We organized in the 43 states that we have coordinating committees. We did significant poll monitoring and making sure that voter suppression didn't have the last word. We also really challenged our political candidates to start taking up the issues and demands of poor people, and compelled someone like Joe Biden to say that if he was elected, that his theory of change would be ending poverty, which was no small feat. And now we plan to hold him to it. So that's a lot. But it's also just a little bit of an intro to the work that we're doing. But I just kind of wanted to lay that out because I think from there we can kind of have a bigger conversation about, what is needed in this moment, what we're trying to do, and how we need in this moment many flowers to bloom, many people to be doing powerful work, and what it looks like for us to kind of partner with different communities and leaders all across this country. So the last thing I'll say is that the importance of the Poor People's Campaign's full name of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is really speaks to what we think needs to happen in this country. That we need to unite and organize poor and low income people. And build a broad movement that involves everybody or involves a good section of everybody. And that group can kind of help organize a revolution of values and a moral revival of the key core values and principles of our sacred texts and traditions and of our Constitution when it's at its best. And that's really, how we kind of ground our work. So we, although we didn't go to the big national organizations, though they now have kind of joined and are a part of the work, we did go to a lot of organized faith bodies and faith communities with either congregations or bases of influence and people that are putting out a different theology, a different understanding of what the moral issues of our day are, trying to broaden the idea that it's just that Jesus was a card-carrying member of the NRA, and that if we just have prayer in schools in a particular way, that will solve all the problems of our society. And instead saying, healthcare is a moral issue, living wages are a moral issue, equitable education is a moral issue, that lifting the load of poverty is a moral issue, that treating Indigenous and Native peoples justly is a moral issue, that taking care of this earth and everything living on it is a moral issue. And so that is actually something that is really important. And we try to partner with all kinds of folks and people of faith, not taking folks out of their communities and not also just wanting faith leaders to be kind of there to only talk about faith, but to really see that to be able to shift this kind of distorted narrative and to push back on it, that we need a different way of being in community and of understanding the role that religion can play and needs to play in a movement. And so So that's, I mean, that's a lot. And sorry, I talked so much, but sometimes I think it's helpful to at least put some stuff out, and then, hopefully we can have more conversation.
Thank you. So we invite you to put questions in the chat, and I see that there's one in there now. Kori, you want to read that for us?
Sure. So, Liz, our first question is, what would you say are the roots or the underlying causality of the scarcity of political will?
Yeah, so I think it's, I think there's a number of things at play, right? I think since Dr. King's death, since the 1960s, I think that's awesome. I love the idea that Poor People's Campaign entered the waiting room. Sorry. Sorry, I got distracted. Really, the word poor has basically become a four-letter word. That politicians won't speak to these issues, that I think as kind of trickled down and neoliberal economic policies have become the order of the day, it's become kind of normalized that poverty exists, and that we should kind of blame poor people, for those issues. And then that it's not just ideas that make it so, but it's also connected to then the kinds of structures and policies, and just the way that society is organized. And so I think, connected to that, you have something like, for the past, since the 90s, for instance, you've had this onslaught of attacks against public housing, against welfare programs, against, with kind of gentrification and with other kind of policies, since the Obama coalition showed that it was possible for poor white and poor Black and poor Latinos to come together. You had this pushback and this onslaught of voter suppression laws. You were at 26 states since 2013 passed racist voter suppression laws. And what we found is that, states that have the highest levels of voter suppression also then have the highest poverty rates, not just amongst people of color, but amongst poor white people, right? You have the least amount of protections for LGBTQ folks. You have the least environmental protections. You have the least high wages. You have the most folks that are going to serve in the military. And so there's a connection between all those issues, and then, smuggling in politicians, because of racist voter suppression laws and attacks on our democracy, and just the power of corporations, the power of the wealthy, the power of our military to kind of determine what the issues of our day are. And so, we've gone through multiple, presidential and midterm elections where the issues of poor and low income people are rarely raised. And so I think all of that kind of contributes to then both in our communities, people thinking it's not possible to have kind of the large scale transformation and change that we need, or that they aren't important and aren't powerful. And then also connected to that, you have, these untold billions going in from lobbyists and from the very most wealthy to keep things the way that they are. And so, I think it's kind of a complex issue, but I think it's the reason that then we have identified that kind of shifting the narrative and building power is what you need to kind of face both the onslaught of attacks, but then also to be able to build up an influence, to be able to really make, deep structural change. I mean, you don't have nearly half of your nation poor and think, one policy, one program, one feeding program is going to do it, right? it takes a major movement of social transformation from the bottom up to change that. And then, what this pandemic has exposed is the existing fissures, inequalities that exist in our society. It's surely deepened them. And it's also spread across our whole society because of the level of racism, the level of poverty, the level of inequality, the level of health problems because of the environment. It's made this virus, and then an ineptitude on the part of a political administration to actually even want to try to curb it. But you can kind of see a similar kind of lack of political will, in the response to the pandemic that's already existed because our society has gotten so used to death, right? I mean, 250,000 people die every year from poverty and inequality. It's a bigger killer than heart attack, strokes, and cancer combined. And we were used to, before this pandemic, 700 people dying a day from poverty, right? So then, of course, it's an extension of that, how we've handled this. Or how the administration has handled it, how our political leaders who have the resources and the ability, to find trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street, but still, won't bail the people out. So there's more to say, but there's more questions coming in too.
Yeah. So then there's a comment about, I think, an appreciation and wanting to hear more emphasis on housing as a right. And I think that's, more broadly in our sort of national and religious discourse, not enough attention is paid to this critical need as homelessness is increasing. And then Victoria asks that many folks here on this call have small faith communities. So out of curiosity, what are other faith communities doing to collaborate with the Poor People's Campaign?
Yeah. So first on the housing thing, I know it wasn't a question, but because I come out of actually homeless work and housing work, I think homelessness and eviction and housing are actually just like such a ground zero for poverty in this country. And thinking about the fact that literally tens of millions of people are on the verge of homelessness in a way that we actually haven't seen in this country before, right? I mean, I got involved in the National Union of the Homeless, an organizing drive amongst poor and homeless people that started in the 80s. I got involved in the early 90s. That was responsible for, winning the right for homeless people to vote, passed a lot of different kind of programs and policies. We were at our height, 30,000 strong in 25 different towns and cities across the country. And part of that, like, kind of movement and that work came because there had been homelessness in our country's history before. But there, kind of what happens in the 70s and 80s is that kind of a new form of economic homelessness becomes the kind of what reigns the day, right? Where you can have more than 50% of people who are without housing working, but they're paid so little that folks can't afford to have a place to live. What we found in our audit is that there's not one town. This is all before the pandemic, and so things are so much worse now, right? But there isn't a town, a city, a county, anything, anywhere, any community in this whole country where if you're working full time at the federal minimum wage that you can afford to even rent a 2-bedroom apartment, right? And so you have, and I'm sure folks have heard this a little bit that in August, for instance, no, maybe it was July, but it was true in August too, that a third of people renters couldn't pay their full month rent. And there's been a moratorium on evictions. There has not been a rent cancellation. And so what it means is that, folks that haven't been able to pay, they haven't been evicted yet. Well, some places they have, but a lot of people haven't been evicted yet, but you still have to pay that money, right? And the moratorium on evictions, even when it was extended by the CDC and Trump, it put the onus on the renter, and not on the bank, not on the housing provider, the landlord, right? Which means that you basically had to have like a signed affidavit that said that just like it's not really a moratorium on evictions. It just sounds good, right? And then even that is still scheduled to expire in December, right? And so the prospect of literally 40 million people becoming homeless basically overnight. We haven't seen that in this country. The Hoovervilles of the 30s, it wasn't 40 million people. It wasn't people from pretty much every demographic, every census district in the country. So anyways, I just want to emphasize the importance of this question of housing and seeing the right to housing, because I think part of the kind of decades-long campaign of blaming and victimizing and racializing and poor and especially homeless people is about trying to take the notion that people have any form of right or entitlement in the best sense of the word, and the fact that a government is supposed to provide for its people. So anyways, I just wanted to say that. And then in terms of this question around faith communities, faith communities are getting involved in lots of different ways. To me, one of the most powerful ways is that there are coordinating committees in states across the country, and the idea of small communities of people banding together with other small communities of people, and working on issues that affect your locale, but then also bring that to a state and to a national level. I mean, that's the way that change actually happens. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, we have something that we call the prophetic council of the Poor People's Campaign, and folks should kind of send an email either to me or to I could put in the chat a couple of other email addresses where if you're not already getting an email for faith leaders, and we define faith leaders, pretty broadly. It doesn't mean that folks are ordained. It doesn't mean that folks are playing a particular role in their community. It's the kind of moral leadership that we need for our society. But so I'm thinking people here identify as faith leaders in many, many ways. But anyways, you're the kind of folk that should be in this kind of prophetic council, and we do pretty regular kind of calls with folks, and then also send out resources. Whether that's Bible studies, whether that's prayers, whether that's there's a lot of different materials and tools. And then also kind of more coordinated work and activities, both on a national level and on a state level, that happens. And there's and then there's also the kind of connecting in your state with the coordinating committee if you aren't already connected, and kind of jumping in and doing the work that folk are doing. And so, right now, next Monday, we're going to be doing caravans in all the states that are part of the campaign, trying to both pull attention to the fact that the work is not done after the election, that we still need a just relief package, and that we need the first policies of the new administration needs to be about, really lifting from the bottom and everybody rising, and particularly around wages, around healthcare, around, all kinds of things. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, thanks. I think that was really helpful. So there's another question about what the criteria is about the 700 people a day die of poverty. And I think how to explain that statistic to folks who might be closed or resistant to that concept.
Yeah. So where it comes from, and is that the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University did a study a bunch of years ago, actually now, trying to kind of categorize death by poverty, right? And basically, I mean, we've been trying to get some of our public health experts, especially those that have come around COVID, who are, you know, constantly sounding the alarm that poverty is bad, you know, for people's health, and it's bad for the society's health, and that poverty and racism are actually, you know, very significant public health concerns, and they're public health concerns, again, that need special attention to those that are impacted the most by them, but then they're also something that makes the whole society less secure and surely less healthy. So again, there's the way that that's categorized is that, or determined, I mean, is like based on this study that these public health officials basically did, you know, looking at a number of factors, and people can find this if you put in Mailman School of Public Health into Google and then say, you know, death by poverty and inequality, you can pull it up. We probably have links to it on the Poor People's Campaign and Cairo Center websites as well, but that might be easier just to put it into Google. But you can get that study, and then it's just that there's 365 days a year, and so we just kind of did the math of, you know, based on these public health experts, you know, saying that this many deaths. What's also been really helpful and interesting is some of the data that some of these public health experts have done around living wages. There's a study that came out some months ago. It was before the, I don't remember when, but it basically says like how living wages and moving the minimum wage to $15 an hour will literally save thousands and thousands of lives. And I think that, you know, I don't know the people in each person's community and some of the doubts and questions that people have. But I think actually being able to show to some people, at least, that the costs of poverty and inequality, the costs of low wages actually outweigh are greater, I mean, than the costs of addressing these issues, right? So if you look at our Jubilee platform, it says, and it's documented there, that it basically costs, and we also just put out another study with the Economic Policy Institute. It's called something about moral policy is good economics or whatever. And they just sent something out about it yesterday. And so again, you can find it really easily. But, you know, it basically that child poverty costs our society $1 trillion a year. For every dollar we invest as a society in early childhood programs, we save $7 in the future, right? And so it's not just that, you know, it's not just that it's immoral and that it's wrong and that it's evil that people are dying, but that it's also hurting our society. It's making us less healthy. It's making us actually more at risk of, you know, pandemics and not being able to respond adequately to storms and to other kind of issues and disasters. And so again, I think there's lots of ways that we kind of explain you can use some of this data, and then there's also people that no matter how much data you throw at them, it's actually the stories of people that are going to impact, and that's part of why also, you know, if you go to our website and if you look at any of the kind of, you know, really long reports that we do, they also have lots of quotes and lots of features on impacted folks, not just telling their sad stories, right? This isn't about, you know, crying some crocodile tears for these individual poor people that are hurting and then having other experts do an analysis of what it's going to take. It's that actually, like, our policy solutions are coming out of the struggles that poor and low income people are waging, right? The way that we have an understanding of what you know, a more just immigration policy is in consultation with our friends at the US-Mexico border who have been doing this work for a long time. The way that we have a sense of what kind of water programs and water affordability programs we could have is because, again, in Flint and in Detroit, they've been at kind of fighting around water for a long time, and have come up with some really powerful solutions that are replicable and that could be shared and made policy across the country. And so I think that's it's connected to how you kind of win hearts and minds. I think is you both kind of show it doesn't have to be this way, and that this is the real impact of what's happening, and then also that folks can be a part of changing it. Because I think sometimes also why people aren't willing to hear, or why we struggle to actually kind of hear about these or remain kind of closed to these ideas, is because they just seem so great. I can think of lots of presentations where I've done where people are like, but this is so depressing. And to me, spending most of my time in many of the poorest parts of this country and world, I find nothing but faith that people think that even though it's really crappy right now, something else is possible, right? And I think that then we have the responsibility to kind of try to preach that or bring that or share that with other people in the world.
So there's some possible career options for you in the chat there, and a link to the Poorest People campaign in there for anyone who has not yet been to their website, who has not signed up for any of our forms or all of that. There's pretty much every week, at least, there's something going on with them. So, you can zoom in. Another question, just a lot of our folks have been involved in work with the homeless and justice issues, and the pandemic has shifted a lot of that, and I know it's shifted stuff for the Poor People's Campaign as well. So I think, if there were sort of like suggestions or ways to get involved or to do this work, especially if you're someone who's at risk, we have some older folks among our faith leaders here, how to do that in the midst of a global pandemic when health and safety kind of requires you to be at home.
That's right. I mean, so the Poor People's Campaign and we've been organizing and been on the road for just years now, right? But still, weeks before it was deemed a pandemic, we pulled ourselves off the road, and we've basically moved all of our work online. Or on the phone, or in the ways that we can still stay connected to folks who don't always also have reliable internet and these kinds of things, and that's because for one, we have a responsibility to the greater society to do everything that we need to do to actually curb this, but also because, like many of the folks that are in our mix, are immunocompromised, have no health care. And so, we were supposed to, the June 20th event that we did, where we had 2.5 million people join us online, it was supposed to be a massive in-person march in Washington. And we pivoted very quickly and said, it's not responsible. The public health experts, are saying, and it wasn't, we didn't want to do something smaller and in people's locations. Like we were like, no, we have to figure out how do we basically pull this online? And the Moral Mondays movement of North Carolina, was a direct action, in-person, nonviolent disobedience movement. But we've now been, for the past couple of months, doing online digital marches, Moral Mondays, where we flood and shut down McConnell's lines, in 8 or 9 of his offices, and just kind of, we can advocate and organize and disrupt from our homes or wherever people, can be kind of in place the most safe as possible. And so much of the work we're doing and will be doing for the next month is online, so we had, lots of folks, doing things like calling and texting and phone banking for this election or for other kind of organizing work. We did have these poll monitors for the folks that couldn't be actually even one-on-one with people. Folks stayed in cars, right? Like so there's a lot of work that can be done. And I to me, it's really important actually that work kind of is done, from how keeping as many people kind of safe as possible. And there are ways, so when we did the June 20th event, we also, set up like an 800 number. So people, for many of the things that we do, there's ways that, folks that are living in homeless encampments, folks that are, in prisons, like are still able to basically kind of participate and connect. But then also, folks that, we are both responsible, but then also still active. And so I really encourage folks to connect up with us. And then also just to, even if you don't connect with us, to know that online organizing in this moment is really important. Like we can still make connections. We can still raise the issues. We can still learn from each other, and we can still advocate and build power this way. And we really need to. So I'm realizing I have to go. I have to teach a class. And so it's been really good to be with folk.
Yes.
And thank you so much for being here with us. So.
Yeah, we were just going to end in prayer. So thank you so much for being with us. It was so illuminating, Liz.
Awesome. Thank you.
Victoria.
It is, we reach into our hearts where your beauty and your justice resides in us. And we have been listening to your voice, oh God, through the voice of Liz Theoharis. There is no doubt in our hearts that a combination of activism and being faith leaders is where we need increasingly to spend our energies and our visions. We want to lift from the bottom to raise everyone up and to enter into the justice that rolls like beautiful water, like clean water, to all of the communities that we can touch. So we are so grateful for this inspiration of Liz Theoharis. Thank you, O God, for her presence, and may we find a way to work in our communities, through our communities, to join the Poor People's Campaign. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Powerful presentation.
Yeah.
I wasn't kidding about nominating her for secretary.
We can go when we have to go get food.
I'm just wondering, before we have to lose other people here, if there's a way that we can gather again to talk about how RCWP, our individual congregations, our individual ministries, whatever that is, could perhaps become more affiliated more with the Poor People's Campaign. Could we either set a time or tell everybody that be on alert for your email that we could set a time for the good troublemakers to come back together?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. Are there people here who have days of the week that is a better day to meet as a group? And also, it might be good to put your email in the chat so we can keep record of that too.
Kori, we have
everyone's email.
Oh yeah, we have it from registration. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can do that. We can send out a notice in that fashion. That would be great.
Mm-hmm.
We could do a doodle again to see when the majority of people are available.
That's a great idea.